Good afternoon, everyone. It is a true pleasure and honor to welcome you to this IGF2025 session in Strengthening Multi-Stakeholder Digital Cooperation for a Resilient and Secure Cyber Ecosystem. My name is Clara Marland, and I work at the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, and I will be your moderator for this discussion. We find ourselves at a pivotal moment in global cyber diplomacy. In just a few weeks, the United Nations Open-Ended Working Group on the Security of and in the Use of ICTs, or OEWG, will conclude its current mandate. Over the past 4 years, this process has brought together all UN member states, which have engaged in detailed discussions on a wide range of topics, from norms of responsible state behavior, confidence-building measures and threats, to the applicability of international law to cyberspace, cyber capacity building, and the establishment of a regular institution dialogue. While the OEWG process formally recognized the value of multi-stakeholder input, today's session invites us to look more closely at how inclusive was that participation in practice, and what lessons can we take forward to ensure that the next phase, the proposed UN Permanent Mechanism on ICT Security, is not only more inclusive, but also effective and resilient in addressing global cyber challenges. So the key question we are asking today is how can we ensure that the expertise, services, and research provided by the broader cyber ecosystem, from nonprofits and civil society to academia and the private sector, are not only recognized, but truly integrated into global cyber governance. That's the focus of our session today, and thank you everyone for being here, also online. This session is intentionally structured in 2 parts. First, we will hear from an expert panel next to me representing government and civil society, who will help us unpack the opportunities and challenges ahead. Then we will turn the conversation over to you, our multi-stakeholder community, to bring your own experiences, perspectives, and practical recommendations to the table. Your input today truly matters. The ideas shared during this session will be captured in a public report submitted to the United Nations ahead of the final OEWG session in July. Our shared goal is to ensure that multi-stakeholder voices help shape the design and implementation of the future UN Permanent Mechanism on ICT Security. A warm thank you to our distinguished panelists from the Cyber Peace Institute, Global Partners Digital, Global Affairs Canada, and the Government of Chile, not only for joining us today, but also for your continued commitment to advancing an inclusive approach to cyber diplomacy. One note before we start, we are all referring to the zero draft of the final report, Annex A, from May 2025. And now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers, each of whom brings a unique lens to the central question we are exploring today. How can the multi-stakeholder community meaningfully shape and support the future UN Permanent Mechanism on ICT security? 2 of our speakers bring insights from government, reflecting national priorities and approaches to international cooperation. On my left is Senator Kenneth Pugh from the Republic of Chile, who has been instrumental in advancing Chile's digital legislative agenda, from the creation of a national cybersecurity agency and cybercrime reforms to convening multi-stakeholder dialogues through the Chilean Cybersecurity Forum. He offers a clear example of how national leadership can align with global frameworks in an inclusive way. Next to him, we have Mr. David Fairchild, First Secretary for Digital Policy and Cybersecurity at the Permanent Mission of Canada to the UN in Geneva, who has closely followed the OEWG process and offers a Canadian perspective on enabling multi-stakeholder participation, including through the joint Canada-Chile non-papers proposing practical ways to structure and leverage stakeholder contributions in the future mechanism. The other 2 speakers represent the broader multi-stakeholder community, offering expertise from civil society and international initiatives. Ms. Rose Payne works as a policy and advocacy lead at Global Partners Digital, works to ensure that human rights are embedded in the governance of digital technologies. With experience across global advocacy organizations, she brings concrete examples of how diverse, underrepresented voices can be better included in policy design. And last but not least, Ms. Francesca Bosco, Chief Strategy Officer at the Cyber Peace Institute, brings nearly 2 decades of experience at the intersection of international law, cyber policy and human rights. Her work focuses on turning global frameworks into practical, inclusive initiatives, particularly through civil society collaboration, capacity building, and threat analysis. Thank you all very much for being here today. It is such a pleasure to have such a diverse and experienced panel. And without further ado, let's just dive into the first part of this workshop, which is our panel. So, Senator, I will guide my first question at you. We are very much interested in Chile's work and how Chile sees its domestic cybersecurity strategy aligning with future global frameworks, particularly the UN Permanent Mechanism, and also what lessons can be drawn from Chile's approach to multi-stakeholder engagement.
Thank you very much, Clara. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really honored to be with Francesca, Rose, David in this panel, and grateful for the United Nations IGF Forum, and especially Norway. I do represent the region of Valparaiso, which is a region that goes from Easter Island in the middle of the Pacific through Robinson Crusoe Island to the Andes. If you go to the Kon-Tiki Museum here in Oslo, you will find all the heritage that all those navigators found. Now we're sailing in a new world, the cyberspace. And to understand the cyberspace, we need to have knowledge, and that's a problem. All the other spaces we know, surface, maritime, space, air, we can see them, we can touch them. The problem is the cyberspace, we cannot understand it. And that's the reason and the importance of the multi-stakeholders, to understand all the different layers that we are facing. And this is a challenge. What I'm proposed to do now, in a very few minutes, is to try to put our example as a country, how we did it in order to build this trust between people, in order to understand and to regulate something that we don't see. Basically, we started creating a month in order to have everybody involved. And we took the month of October. That we did it in 2018, it's a long time ago, and every October we get together to understand all the new things and the new threats, because it's called the Cybersecurity Month. We cannot go into the digital world without cybersecurity, and that's important to understand it. Once we start this with a law that says that also you have to train and prepare exercises during that month, we use the Parliament, the Senate, which was with a commission, a futures committee, in order to prepare a book. And to write a book is the best way to get people involved, because you have to ask everybody. You have to talk, you have to have the will, and then you will get the trust. So that's the Chilean way. Talk, of course, seminars, then will. We have to have something that we can prove this is what we would like to, and then we build the trust. With that trust, we use European influence, Brussels influence, basically with all the regulations being those, the two ways that the European does, but we do it on our own way. We take everything as a directive and we do the transposition. In the case of cybersecurity, NIS, which we started with, in the middle of the process, that was December 28, 2022, it changed to NIS2. Immediately, we took it and we prepare with all the multi-stakeholder that we have already created. So this was the first example where we had everybody involved. Even in the law, if you go, you're going to find 6 articles relate to what I'm saying. 3 of them says that there will be a special committee. It's going to be a public-private committee with 1 person from the government and 6 persons from the other sectors. 2 from the industry, 3 from academia, and 2 from the organized civil society. So within the law, we have the mechanism to embed and to have these public-private work together. People is there for 6 years, and every 3 years we change them. And the other 2 articles, which are very important, was to have all the cybersecurity researchers as part of the cybersecurity framework law. And these are the hackers, the hacker community, which are good people, they are investigators. So we prepare a special article for them so they can report all vulnerabilities of the government not being a crime. And that's important. And also the agent in the agency has not to say he is committing a crime. This is only for government system. For private system, they have to ask permission. So having said that, if we want to understand globally now, which is our problem, what we said is in this environment, in the cyberspace and in cybersecurity, we do not compete, we collaborate. And that's basically what everybody is doing in an annual forum we have that 3 times a year we get together. This has gone even to the north. Later on, Canada will do it. We have prepared a strategy in order to have integrated within the discussion how the most important or meaningful stakeholders can be part of this process. If you want to see and visit us, we're going to be expecting you in Valparaiso, where the Congress is. Or you can follow all the activities we're doing. Everything is done also online, and we're trying to spread it. We're available in order to build a better and safe cyber world, but we have to be aware and to have more knowledge of people. That is what we're working now, Clara. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator. It was inspiring to hear government's perspective on leveraging the knowledge, which you said is scarce in cyberspace, also from the multi-stakeholder community. And what a better way than embed it in law. So this is very interesting perspective. On this note, Canada has also consistently advocated for meaningful multi-stakeholder inclusion in cyber diplomacy. So turning now to you, David, could you share how the Canada-Chile non-papers propose to operationalize stakeholder contributions in the suggested future UN mechanism?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Senator Pu, for your introductory comments. And it's great to be here today, and thank you to JFCE for organizing the event, and to my other co-panelists. This is my last IGF, so I'm going to first off start by saying it's been a fantastic 5-year run of participating in what is, in fact, the emblem of multi-stakeholderism. So I think the OEWG could learn a lot from the IGF as a principle for how to model cybersecurity discussions. So I have lots of prepared remarks. I will try to breeze through them because I think some of it is a bit sort of stated in many other fora and pretty obvious. 2024 and 2025, as we all know, has been sort of an important year. We saw the culmination of the Pact of the Future, the Global Digital Compact, obviously much more germane to the conversation, panelists here, which, as we know, multi-stakeholder was a huge political football that was kicked around during negotiations. This somewhat mirrors, I think, what we generally see and have seen for a progressive period within the Cyber Open-Ended Working Group. This year, as you know, next week, in fact, and over the next couple of weeks, is the culmination of the second Open-Ended Working Group on cyberspace. And so member states are currently preparing for what will be the final negotiations and hopefully landing the final report. We have progressively seen over the entirety of the Cyber Open-Ended Working Group process difficulties ensuring meaningful contribution from stakeholders. My participation with the Open-Ended Working Group has always demonstrated the high value of stakeholders, but we have seen progressive attempts by certain member states to prevent that. So Canada, as one of its priorities during the Open-Ended Working Group, was to focus on stakeholder participation. So this is really the sort of a looking back perspective of how we try to ensure maximum participation in these very important discussions. So even though we anticipate agreement by consensus, or we hope for agreement by consensus on the final report, Obviously, there are elements that remain, important elements of the final report that remain to be hammered out. And one of them is the shape of what's to come after the end of this phase. So this is the second open-ended working group. There has been progressive discussions and agreements to the establishment of a regular institutional dialogue, which we, the like-mindeds, have put forward and is commonly known as the Program of Action. This is meant to be what would be, at the end of this, this session, a permanently established platform that would allow, from our perspective, all stakeholders to have a platform to engage on these substantive issues in a less politicized and more meaningful way. As I'm sure some of you in the room know, this was put forward under the leadership of France and Egypt several years ago. And it was really an attempt for us to move beyond the highly politicized, highly stilted, very sort of staid conversations that we see in First Committee with prepared speeches, a lot of time spent on procedural matters and little time for stakeholders. And what we believe is that in order to implement the framework for responsible state behavior and address some of the concrete challenges, we need to ensure that the stakeholder community is at the table meaningfully. I have said this progressively over my 4-year posting. The DNA of this space is multi-stakeholder. I think it becomes highly problematic in the First Committee context of international peace and security, where member states tend to have had a monopoly on decision-making, and that's sort of historical in the context of cyberspace and digital space. What we see is private sector, community organizations, academics, all have agency and equity in this space, and I think that's systematically underrepresented in the cyber open-ended working group, despite our efforts. So how did we do this? We were actively participating in the French-led efforts under the POA, but I think what we began to realize is that it needed a little bit of a boost. And so Canada and Chile decided to work together to begin a long series of consultations globally with partners of all walks to try to develop a more comprehensive understanding of what this regular institutional dialogue and mechanism should look like. A number of papers were produced, and in the first instance, it was an attempt to try to develop a repository of the positive benefits that stakeholders could and should and do bring to this process. You know, how do they deliver capacity? How do they protect systems? How do they add public policy value to the discourse? And to raise awareness of their involvement in this space. And so in the second phase, we continued these consultations, participating in a number of activities with an idea that ultimately to try to break the deadlock, as I'm sure some who follow this process, there are very entrenched political views on what the next phase of this could look like. And it's important because the owners and operators of cyber infrastructure tend to be a blend, and in fact, in some countries tend to be more in the private sector. You know, the frontline organizations dealing with cyber attacks and the harms on civilization, on societies can be equally civil society, local governments, communities. And so I think what we wanted to ensure through the process was to develop a narrative and a functional way forward that would help, in fact, try to break the deadlock, and hopefully we're successful in that. One of the key elements, of course, is the modalities issue, and I think some of the very people in this room have suffered from the inevitable veto that member states have over the participation of stakeholders in some of these meetings. We have found workarounds over the years to, invite members to join delegations. We hold a number of side events where, non-accredited organizations can come and speak to member states. But we've always felt throughout that it's just insufficient. It just doesn't really recognize the true value of the stakeholder community. And so at this point, these papers have been submitted. They are up in the cloud. They have been posted to the OEWG website. A number of co-sponsors have signed on. Without putting too much emphasis on it, I think really where we are at this point is there's no guarantees that the plane will be landed at the upcoming session. I think we need to recognize it's going to be a bit of a tough road. If you have a chance to review the BRICS foreign minister statement from just a couple of weeks ago, it's very clear, and I'm just going to bring it up here quickly, is that, they in their own final communique reflect this very point, that they see the future of ICT and cyberspace as a multilateral member state-led activity. And so we are, in a way, fighting upstream to make the point. And I think what we hope to see in the next couple of weeks is a real breakthrough. What it may look like, I think, is an open debate. The principles are at least agreed, but whether it's a number of working groups that are structured under a broader chapeau that's New York-based remains to be seen. But critical for Chile and Canada is that the stakeholder involvement is base-plated into whatever modalities, into whatever the future framework looks like. So I think, if I can, Claire, I'm going to stop there and turn it over to my very capable and able colleagues. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, David. I think it was very interesting how you mentioned the member state-led activity. Just to maybe clarify, this is not something that we want to challenge, but we just want to add to it the knowledge and the research and everything. So the non-papers also a very strong message is that we don't want to vote, we don't want to fight this intergovernmental process, but we just want to be heard, we just want voice, and we believe that this multi-stakeholder approach is the right way forward for inclusivity and also for sustainability. So now turning to Rose, some states at the UN still remain cautious about involving a broad range of stakeholders in these sensitive international security discussions, fearing that it could dilute focus or introduce less relevant voices. So how would you respond to such concerns? And also more broadly, how can we better demonstrate the unique value that diverse non-state actors bring to processes like the UN permanent mechanism?
Thanks so much, Clara, and thank you for the opportunity to speak about this topic a couple of weeks before the final meeting. It's really important. Particularly happy to be sitting here with representatives of Canada and Chile, given the important role that you've played in really championing stakeholder inclusion. I was really happy when you sent me this question, actually. So, particularly picking up on those two words, relevance and legitimacy, I'd probably turn that back a little bit to ask what kind of relevance and legitimacy we're trying to build without the meaningful inclusion of stakeholders who operate and own digital infrastructure, who are instrumental in actually dealing with threats, who are carrying out vital capacity building activities which support states in both participating in the OEWG, but also in implementing the norms of responsible state behavior, and who have also, throughout the process, offered concrete guidance and research on the application of international law and the impact of policies on human rights. I think that we've seen many states pick up on these existing things that they've done, and I hope that along with the non-papers and the fantastic work by governments who are supportive of stakeholder inclusion, those things will help convince some of the countries which are a little bit more cautious, if we want to put it like that. I'm going to expand a little bit on the unique value stakeholders bring to these state-led processes. I hope that a lot of people in the room might already be convinced, and David, you've done a fantastic job of touching on this, but I do think it's worth reiterating. So they can help raise awareness of international state-led processes on a national level. They can build momentum and build trust in these kind of big international processes which can feel quite remote to the people who are actually impacted on the ground. Second, stakeholders have a role to play in building bridges between different camps. As David touched on, and for anyone who follows the OEWG, it won't be a surprise for me to say that it's been a little bit difficult to make progress on a number of issues, in part because of geopolitical divides between countries who do hold fundamentally quite different viewpoints. Stakeholders help to bring fresh perspectives and to conduct research and bring evidence which can help to move conversations forward when we work together in good faith. Third, stakeholders have a proximity to affected communities which governments don't necessarily have. And here I'm thinking specifically about historically marginalized communities or communities which are experiencing vulnerability. It is individuals who are the principal targets of cyber threats. Civil society organizations, academia, and those working with affected communities can provide bottom-up and up-to-date understanding of the impact of threats on individuals, which can help to feed into those policy discussions. Fourth, as I've kind of touched on, stakeholders do hold expertise which can be supportive to states during negotiations. And I think I'll come on to touch on that a little bit more, but that expertise can help increase the legitimacy and implementability of policies. So looking back at some of the lessons learned from the OEWG and forward to the current, and by that I mean the one that was already online, because we've heard there's going to be a new version soon of the version of the annual progress report, which does outline the structure of the future mechanism. Very, very briefly going to touch on how stakeholders can play a useful role. So particularly looking at thematic groups. At the moment, the APR suggests that non-governmental stakeholders will be able to participate in the thematic groups. I want to emphasize how useful it will be to have spaces for stakeholders to really be able to directly interact with states on issues which they have the most expertise in. However, with a small caveat that states may not know all of the expertise held by stakeholders, so it's important that stakeholders are able to participate across thematic groups, that technical experts in a particular area is not a kind of appointed condition of them being able to participate. So second of all, during the plenary sessions, allowing stakeholders to react to each agenda item, potentially in a short dedicated session during each section of the agenda, means that they can react to proposals in somewhat real time. During the OEWG, stakeholders primarily could intercede during a dedicated afternoon. They would either need to comment on every pillar of work at once, or try and follow specific guiding questions. This really diluted their ability to support states in understanding the merits or challenges of new proposals as they came up. And it doesn't really allow for a two-way dialogue. It's really vital that the permanent mechanism allows stakeholders to support states across all pillars of work. So what needs to happen for them to play that role is they need to be able to be in the room. As David touched on, the accreditation process meant that any state could essentially veto a stakeholder without sharing a rationale. That needs to be addressed by making it more transparent who has vetoed a particular stakeholder and why. That stakeholder can actually go and really understand and address those concerns, first of all. It also, I particularly also want to support the suggestion found in the Chile and Canada non-paper that objections to stakeholders' participation should be used as a kind of last resort, and to also reflect that the majority vote mechanism used during the ad hoc Committee on Cybercrime worked quite well. In terms of more concrete suggestions on how meaningful stakeholder inclusion can be meaningfully enabled in the future mechanism, next Tuesday during the informal stakeholder discussion organized by the chair, a group of civil society organizations will come and present a number of different ideas, so I hope that we'll see you there. Just to kind of finish off, we do need to take the lessons learned from the open-ended working group and other relevant processes into the future mechanism. Because if it has modalities which facilitate truly meaningful stakeholder engagement, stakeholders will be able to play an even more of a role in sharing research and evidence, raising human rights concerns, and even helping to bridge divides between states. Quite apart from that, stakeholders really stand ready to be a resource for states, so we hope that we'll be able to play that role.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rose. You touched upon so many interesting parts that I'm sure they will feed directly into the report that we plan to submit after the session. The current struggle with accreditation is truly one of the biggest obstacles for meaningful participation of stakeholders. From just the brief perspective of GFC, we have been leading the Women in International Security and Cyberspace Fellowship, which since the beginning of the process, it enabled female diplomats and cybersecurity professionals to actually attend these sessions, especially from small underrepresented states. We have boosted the participation of women from 37% in the first session to 55% in the latest one, and enabled 120 women from 55 UN member states to take part in UN cybercrime and cybersecurity discussions. So more than 25% of UN member states benefited from this program delivered by a non-governmental stakeholder. Of course, this initiative is sponsored by 7 governments, but we're very proud that we get to facilitate that, and it would be great to keep doing the great work that we do as a multi-stakeholder community. So now, before we jump into the second part of this session, which will be an interactive discussion, I will like to dedicate the last question to Francesca, to tell us a little bit more about what, in your view, should be concrete role that civil society organizations can play in supporting states and the future UN permanent mechanism, especially in areas such as cyber capacity building, threat analysis, and operational implementation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Clara, and the GFC for the invite and for the opportunity to contribute to the discussion with such experienced and inspiring panelists. The Cyber Peace Institute indeed is a global civil society organization that is focusing on both addressing the societal harms of cyber attacks with a focus on underserved communities, but also at the same time to provide active cybersecurity assistance and indeed provide evidence-based knowledge and capacity building to policymakers at national and international level, like within UN processes. It's a pleasure to follow the great remarks that was provided and when you were enumerating the ways that the multi-stakeholder community can actively contribute, I went into archaeology mode and I retrieved that back in 2021, so it's nothing new in a way, what we're discussing, and also thanks David for depicting the process so well. We provided a statement on the value of the multi-stakeholder engagement, coupling a letter that at that time civil society provided, focusing on the modalities. And back then, we emphasized the key value of, for example, researching existing and potential threats in the sphere of information security, further develop the rules, norms, and principles of responsible behavior of states and the ways of implementation, how international law applies to the use of information and communication technologies by states, research and monitoring the application of confidence-building measures in different contexts, and, for example, work towards an effective, sustainable capacity-building process, playing a key educational role by disseminating and diffusing knowledge about cybersecurity and responsible state behavior. So, with the interest of time, I want to be very concrete and bring some examples of then, I mean, we try to walk the talk, let's say, since 2021, and I would like to focus on 2 key areas. On one hand, I mean, also following your question, so on how the multi-stakeholder community, notably civil society, can contribute to evidence-based policy development and threat analysis, as well as, let's say, considering civil society not only as consumers, in a way, of cybersecurity, but also producers of cybersecurity as public good. And in the first case, the multi-stakeholder community has the experience, the operational knowledge, and contextual understanding of the impact, for example, of cyber incident, which is essential to inform policy debates and the development of effective solutions that are anchored in a sort of, like, I would call a wider human rights-based framework. We've been consistently advocated for a human-centric and evidence-based approach to cybersecurity within the open-ended working group project and process. And it's not just a principle, but we really call it a sort of like imperative. And following what Rose was mentioning in terms of contributing with expertise, also across the different type of thematic groups, the example that I can bring is that, for example, we developed a methodology to assess the harm that cyber attacks and disinformation operations are causing to society. And we use the methodology to bring also concrete examples and providing data and submitting the data to the open-ended working group via the various statements, and also working with a few governments, a few, let's say, friend governments, and for also being able, for example, to develop what we call the cyber incident tracers, so monitoring attacks against the healthcare and what it means for people when cyber attacks hit an hospital. We develop a cyber incident tracer monitoring platform when it comes to the attacking civilian infrastructure in the context of conflict, for example, what it means for society, what it means for the population. We develop a cyber incident tracer that is focusing on attacks that are hitting, for example, civil society organizations, humanitarian organizations that are active in development and humanitarian context. With this data and with the analysis of this data, we provided this knowledge, again, to support a real understanding of cybersecurity, because if we are talking about developing cyber norms, well, norms needs to, let's say, to reflect the reality of what's happening in real life when cyber attacks are hitting. Also bridging local experience, working with a lot of civil society organizations, international organizations active in the field and on the ground, up to the global policy, and also translating, in a way, the field realities into policy recommendations. And we had a couple of very concrete examples, working, for example, with the government of Czech Republic, where we work in terms of creating knowledge and capacity building, specifically in the field of attacks against critical infrastructure, notably the healthcare sector, or, for example, in emphasizing the importance of the victim-centric approach when it comes to analyzing the impact of cyber attacks. And thanks to the government of Belgium, we were able to hold 2 side events during the previous edition of the Open-Ended Working Group. So this is more for, let's say, the evidence-based policy making. But then, as mentioned, and I will finish with that, civil society are producer of cybersecurity public goods. A role that is directly relevant to the Open-Ended Working Group calls for inclusive implementation of norms and capacity building. To this end, there are initiatives like the Nonprofit Cyber Coalition, where we are sharing cybersecurity resources developed by nonprofit, and specifically one initiative that is called Common Good Cyber, which is a global initiative with the goal to identify and implement innovative models for sustaining groups, organizations, individuals involved in critical cybersecurity functions for the broader internet community. And we have organizations like Shadow Server Foundation, Global Cyber Alliance, FIRST, Quad 9, that basically are securing the backbone of the internet. And they work directly. Their work directly supports basically the Open-Ended Working Group goals for enhancing the security of the ICTs and protecting critical infrastructure, for example, especially in underserved regions. And these nonprofits also contribute to confidence building measures by offering transparent, non-commercial cybersecurity resources that can be trusted in a wide range of actors. I recommend reading a paper that is coming up next week, co-published together with the EU ISS, specifically detailing and mapping how non-profit contribute to cybersecurities. And there is also one specific piece that is focusing on the multi-stakeholder participation and the civil society participation to the Open-Ended Working Group. And a good example of how also thanks to the involvement in the Open-Ended Working Group, you can make concrete change and impactful change. Just at the beginning, just the 17th of June, at the beginning of this week as well, allow me to mention that the state of United Kingdom and Canada announced in a joint statement at the G7 that they are supporting the Common Good Cyber Fund, that it's an initiative to strengthen global cybersecurity by supporting nonprofits that deliver core cybersecurity services that protect civil society actors at high risk and the internet as a whole. So it's possible, it's happening, and I mean, this is also where I think the discussion about the multi-stakeholder contribution can have a very meaningful impact. Allow me just to finish with one thing, which is also very much in line with what Rose mentioned, and this is also why even after 2021, we're still here basically discussing about this, and I'm very thankful to be at the table with Canada and Chile, and thank you so much for your proposal. I can give you the practical experience that we are facing, because despite, let's say, the technical and operational expertise that was also recognized by states, many civil society actors are still currently excluded due to the non-objection rule and limited access to documents, lack of sustainable funding to participate in the forums, and despite trying to play by the rule, because we requested the ECOSOC accreditation in 2022, I check. Now, 3 years later, still our application has been deferred to 2026, despite asking several clarifications that were regularly and timely provided, and we've been vetoed again, just the news from last week, from the accreditation to this session. So despite, I mean, some good and meaningful contribution, this is why it's so relevant to have the actors that you can see here at the table that we are, and I mean, and that we are still discussing, basically, these super important issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesca. It's also good to reflect on the practical challenges that you experience, and as a GFC, we can join you in that in that fight. I think it was great to hear about the importance of the role of civil society, also, as you said, human-centric, and bringing the evidence-based approach to cybersecurity, because excluding those voices, we don't want to see what type of future we will have regarding the future permanent mechanism on ICT security. So this is definitely important. So now I would like to turn to you, also online, whoever is listening online. You can reflect on what you've just heard, share your own experiences or best practices, and offer concrete recommendations for how the future UN permanent mechanism can be inclusive, effective, and grounded in collaboration. We have also prepared some guiding questions, which you can see on the slide behind us. I will read them briefly, and in the meantime, feel free to line up. We have 2 microphones on the side here, and I was told the best approach is that you just line up in front of microphones so we can answer as many questions as possible and also feed as much input for the report that we will submit to the United Nations ahead of the final OEWG session in July. So let me read the questions. First one is, what role should nonprofits and civil society play in the future UN permanent mechanism, and what would that look like in practice? Second one is, how can we ensure that underrepresented voices are meaningfully included? What are some sustainable strategies for ensuring multi-stakeholder input is not ad hoc but continuous? And lastly, are there any other international processes that offer good models for non-state stakeholder engagement? Perfect, and I see that we already have a first speaker lineup, so Francis, the floor is yours.
I don't know if you can hear me. Oh, perfect. I'm part of YouthDig, which is the European Youth IGF, and I just have a question, basically to the whole panel, about the quality of this multi-stakeholder approach, insofar as, at least my impression is, to some extent, the stakeholders involved in the multi-stakeholder process might be self-selecting. So what does that change, and how does that affect the quality of the kind of dialogues we're having in forums or panel discussions, insofar as, especially I think the private sector and industry will first of all self-select as to whether it actually is going to affect them, the kind of discussions that are happening, and if it's not, then why would they attend? And is that a problem for you? Do you see that there's some solutions or ways to fix this? And yeah, because I just think that maybe the incentive structure, does it work? Maybe the incentive structure just is a bit off in this way. So how can we ensure that when we're having these multi-stakeholder models and dialogues, that always there are people represented, even if it's not necessarily in their best interest to be there? Okay, thank you.
Perfect. So this is exactly what we are discussing here, right? How can people be represented in the most efficient way? Anybody would like to comment on this question? Yes, Senator, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the question. We use the KYC, know your customer. You have to know the other part, and that's very important. then start to try to have something in common. The good idea is to, when you invite everybody. But once you invite everybody, you have to see who didn't want to attend or who's not there. Those are the ones that you have to really work, because it's like singing to the choir. Let's say you don't have to preach the converted ones. You have to find the other ones. That's the way we did it. Know your customer, and when you see that in your map of multi-stakeholders, there are others that you know that exist, that they are not part of it, you have to talk and see why they're not there. Try to make them to be within.
Yeah, Rose, you want to add to these remarks?
Yes, I can also come in on that. Apologies, my hearing is terrible, which is a bit of a downside in a job which relies mostly on talking. But I think that what you were saying was about self-selection of stakeholders and whether that's a kind of problem. Speaking specifically to the OEWG, in my opinion, it's quite a long process. It's gone on for a long time. It happens in New York, which is very expensive. The people who are in the room really want to be there. So yes, and to be honest, it's not really self-selection in this case, because there is this issue of accreditation. But in terms of the kind of quality of their interventions and the work that they do there is really no point in them not trying to make their interventions and their work as relevant as possible. In my opinion, I actually think that we have some partners in the room, I think, who've worked with GPD in trying to really look on a national level, like the impact of different policies, trying to make sure that the evidence base is really there. I really would say that actually it's not a problem for the OEWG. Self-selection has worked quite well insofar as it has gone, insofar as people put themselves forward and then a lot of them are vetoed. It would be fantastic actually to have a much more diverse group of voices in the room. Francesca, I wish that Cyber Peace Institute didn't keep getting vetoed, because you obviously do fantastic work, which is really fundamental to cyber resilience. So, yeah.
David, I think you also want to comment.
Yes, I'll just very quickly. You're absolutely right. And I think one of the issues we find is, and you can just look in this room, it's very expensive to take part and to be at every single UN meeting. And what we see is, unfortunately, overrepresentation from some stakeholder elements. There are obviously ones who can afford it, have local staff based in New York in order to cover the waterfront. And I think you're sort of alluding to different issues. The UN rules themselves also don't always lend themselves to effective stakeholder participation. During COVID, we moved to a virtual world. The UN essentially bent their own rules, and now they're forcing us back to working only in person, despite the fact that member states have suggested this is probably not optimal. So in the UN Geneva space, for instance, in the Human Rights Council, we are now back to full in-person informal. So this, has a real effect. There's simple solutions on the surface of it, but they're not so simple when you look behind the velvet curtain. I participated in the Sao Paulo Net Mundial Plus 10. It's the only non-UN multi-stakeholder forum, at least in the 4 years that I have been here. There is a published principles which we tend to highlight and encourage member states to adopt, whether it be in the IGF, OEWG. It isn't just about in opening the door to member states, it's about finding a way to modify your own work methods to accommodate stakeholders. And I can sort of practically speak to that, and I think, which I'll come back to. But also, I think the other reality is there are member states who either maybe don't have a healthy stakeholder community in their own country, don't want to talk to their multi-stakeholder community, but worst of all, may want to but don't have the means to. And so it is a bit of a vicious circle for some member states. And you see that floating up into these international processes. And so I'm very, humble in the sense that, Canada can easily represent itself both at the national government, but also in the stakeholder community sense. That is not the case for every member state. That is not the case for every community. And I think we're seeing progressive attempts to try to rectify that. And here I'll bridge back to, obviously, in the context of the IGF, Canada's, very publicly wants to see the IGF not only renewed, but made permanent and provided a budget that will ensure not only its survivability, but ensure that there is going to be maximum participation from all sectors in all regions of the globe. And so that can only be done with effective budgeting and effective financing for participation and not working on a voluntary basis. And just to sort of finally bridge back, in the context that I work on the Digital Governance Working Group, which has been mandated through the GDC Global Digital Compact that was signed off, the membership is 27 member states and 27 non-member states. So it's equal participation, but we don't have the budget to ensure their participation, and we don't have even the means to provide necessarily virtual participation, which makes it extremely impossible for some. We have some non-member states who are based in Australia who have been selected to participate. It will take this person more time to travel to the event than the event itself. That is not what I would personally call meaningful participation. And that's something that I think we continue to at least try to fix. Canada was successful in at least something as simple as asking that there be a second vice chair for that working group that represents the 27 non-member states. These are small things that I think Canada, at least I'm highlighting simply because I know about them, but I think they reflect a deeper problem, which is we can just abide by the existing rules, which are, quite frankly, designed for member states within the UN context. I think we have to be a little bit more nimble, particularly, and understand that stakeholders all come in all sizes, shapes, and a small member, small stakeholder doesn't necessarily have the capability and may need more time. And so something as simple as issuing papers with enough time for all member states and stakeholders to reflect and provide feedback, publishing them so that observers and stakeholders and participants can have access to. These are small things, and they're not necessarily relevant per se to the open-ended working group, but these are common features, at least in the 4 years that I've been on this kind of file, that I think I would reflect as sort of things that we can do, but we don't always do.
Perfect. Let's briefly hear from Francesca, and then we have line-up gentlemen on the right side and another gentleman on the left side, and then also online chat. So let's be quick.
No pressure. So super quick. +1 to what David was mentioning, because I was trying to reflect on, where we can learn, what can be a good model, and although it's not cyber-specific, but indeed the Net Mondial +10 held last year offers some concrete examples of successful modalities for stakeholder engagement, notably, for example, seeking input through online coalitions, consultations previous to the event, and to inform the outcome document, making stakeholder submission public, contributing to transparency, and also holding working session throughout the event where stakeholders could take the floor through an open mic system and make intervention on a rolling basis. Just to mention, going back to our, let's say, main topic, I second what Rose was mentioning in terms of that there are some forms of solidarity and support, I think, which is definitely a plus of this of the challenges, let's say, that we are facing within this process, specifically within the civil society community, but I would say with the overall multi-stakeholder community. So we are trying to join forces when it comes to the joint statement, but also forming kind of strategic coalitions organized around the thematic expertise, for example. It's something that is also very helpful that can, especially thinking about the next mechanism potentially with the thematic groups, it's something that can be proven valuable.
Perfect. Okay, let's turn to the second question.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, dear panelists, dear audience. My name is Boris Radanovic. I'm Head of International Development at SWGFL. We are a 25-year-old not-for-profit charity believing in a mission to enable everybody to benefit from technology free from harm. And just about a month ago, we are proud that we are in special consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council. We focus on online safety, protection of children and adults online. I've only been in this space for a decade, and the only answer to all of these problems is a multi-stakeholder environment where all voices are respected equally. But if you would allow me, Madam Moderator, to bring another light to this discussion, we have developed 3 years ago a platform called StopNCII.org, Stop Non-Consensual Intimate Image Abuse. As you know and might have heard in the last panel, more than 300 million children every year suffer from child sexual abuse. Our numbers show that more than 40 million women across the world suffer from non-consensual intimate image abuse. I'm really interested to understand how tools like this and many others fit into the broader cybersecurity frameworks. How do you see survivor-focused, civil society-led solutions being integrated into the new mechanism for ICT security? Our platform is already used by millions. It's supported by major platforms across the world. It is privacy-preserving, victim-led, and designed to be scalable across regions. I'd love to explore how it might work for you. And if you would allow me, Madam Moderator, to ask the panel, how do you see tools that work and listen to the victims on the ground being incorporated in this mechanism going forward? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Maybe let's also collect the second question from online chat, and then we can just pick and choose which one you prefer to answer, or just briefly touch upon both.
Okay, this Chris, just being remote moderator here. This question's from Alasana Cham, and the question is, what multi-stakeholder strategies do we use to reduce the power imbalance that exists in the multi-stakeholder engagement process? For example, governments appear to be more powerful and influential, most especially at the national level. And I think we also have another speaker who wanted to take the floor in Zoom briefly, Martin Koyabi, if that's possible.
Perfect. So let's see if we can.
Martin, are you able to? Martin Koyabi. Sorry.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. And of course, thank you for the panelists and the input that have been provided. I just wanted to give, my name is Martin Koyabe, I'm at the GFC Africa, and I just wanted to give a perspective on the Africa region, but more importantly, some of the concerns that need to be taken into account. If you consider the region, which has also quite a number of least developed countries, nearly 33 out of the 44, you would find that there are specific challenges that need to be addressed as a prerequisite. Number one is the issue around the maturity of, let's say, the cyber security posture of most of the countries. You'd find that most of these countries are either at the point of developing national cybersecurity strategies or even implementing some of the key areas, including some of the critical infrastructure aspects that have been touched on by the speakers. In that case, you find that the priority of these countries do vary because they do have specific needs, most of it in development rather than cyber. So that needs also to be addressed in terms of how do we make sure that countries that have kind of like less priorities are also included at the same level with countries that are negotiating, whether at regional or at international level. The second point also is how do we build trust between countries? Because one of the fundamental issues that many of the African countries face is the issue around the difficulty of implementing CBMs, because CBMs require trust-building mechanisms in order for that to function, especially when you have functional certs or even regular information exchange. And this faces a very, very issue of trust. And then finally, is the issue that has been touched on, which focuses on resources, and especially when it comes to the level of expertise. While we increase participation, especially as alluded of women and other levels of the civil society into this particular process, we find that many institutions do not instill what we call an institutional memory of how these processes can be established. So the call here is to look at establishing what we call a framework of engagement of these particular countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I think each speaker here, each of the panelists can be given like max 30 seconds to answer any of these questions. Maybe just to quickly comment on the first one. So looking at civil society-led solutions and how they can be fed into the future permanent mechanism. Number one is potentially allowing hybrid participation in the dedicated thematic groups, meaning that there will be much wider multi-stakeholder community that can actually participate and provide their input. I think that is one recommendation that we will put in the report that we submit ahead of the final session. But I will open the floor to my other panelists. Maybe from Senator Kenneth, we can just go quick final reflections before we need to conclude.
Thank you, Clara. Well, it's very important to understand that internet gives us the leverage. Then the platform, stopncai.org. So we can be connected, and also we have artificial intelligence. You saw it there. So using these tools and Zoom, we were able to interact. That is important of this meeting. We can do it. We have the tools. We have the will, the commitment. Now we have to make it a reality. So public policies for that, to make it for good. And for that, we need all the help, all the people, all the multi-stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. David, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, this feels like I'm preaching to the choir, of course, the multi-stakeholder model, and merely to simply say is, don't stop fighting. It feels like it's a never-ending uphill battle, but I think there are champions out there. Maybe they're not always evident, but I think as for Canada and Chile, and in one context or in other countries and others, it's about rallying the support and knowing who actually is the person to influence an outcome, and that isn't always the highest ranking official in the room. So there, I'll leave it at that.
Perfect. Rose?
Can I just double check? This was on the first question, right?
Yes, okay. I briefly answered on the first one, but feel free to also comment.
Okay. Here I'm going to give a shout out to a couple of other organizations. First of all, the GFC. I think that when it comes to actually bringing together different tools and methodologies, they are the place to go. I would strongly encourage any organization who are working on cyber solutions and who are not currently involved to reach out. Second of all, I want to highlight the work of our colleagues at the Association for Progressive Communications, who've done an awful lot of work, specifically when you're referring to survivor-centric approaches. They've done an awful lot of work looking at how you can integrate gender into the interpretation and implementation of the 11 UN norms, and have fed that work into the OEWG quite extensively, so I also recommend looking them up.
Perfect, thank you.
And quickly, maybe one of the initiatives that I mentioned before, the non-profit cyber. So if you're a non-profit that is working on cybersecurity, double check, because we created a matrix that you can contribute to. So you can upload, for example, the tools that you're working on, and actually this is also addressing one of the recommendations, let's say, that we have for the permanent mechanism, which is indeed to focus on implementing transparent tracking systems for stakeholder contributions, including the submission, for example, of tools, because we do believe that a wealth of information is lost because there's not centralized repository. There are some very good attempts, but indeed having a sort of like centralized repository with all the stakeholder inputs and how they can influence final documents and decisions is key.
Perfect. So maybe just to briefly conclude, thank you everyone for being part of this discussion. You also know where to find us in case your questions were not answered or you have any additional input for the report. We would love to hear from you. What we have heard makes one thing clear today, and that is that meaningful multi-stakeholder engagement is not just a principle on paper. It is essential if you want to build a trusted, inclusive, and effective approach to cyber governance, both at the United Nations and in our wider global efforts. So what are we going to do now? Firstly, we will pull together key points from today's session and also from additional input we receive from you into a short summary report. This will include reflections from the panel and practical recommendations shared during the discussion, and it will be made publicly available and submitted to the United Nations ahead of the final OEWG session in July, and also presented in the informal town hall meeting with OEWG chair next week. Second, we really encourage you to stay engaged. As it was mentioned, the GFC community is wide and broad, so we welcome all multi-stakeholders to join us. And also this process will help shape how the future and permanent mechanism on ICT security can take form, what form it will shape, and your input really continues to matter. Whether you come from civil society, academia, private sector, government, your perspective plays a crucial part. And yeah, finally, as I said, please share with us any additional input. We would love to hear from you. And let's keep the conversation going. Make sure that multi-stakeholder voices continue to shape the future of cyber diplomacy. Thank you once again, and we look forward to what comes next. Thank you.